Hi there, welcome to this information session. So in today's session, we're going to look at what stammering is, what causes stammering, and ways that you can support your child. And then at the end, we'll just have a think about what next. So what are your next steps after today's little session? The information in this webinar has all been sourced from the Michael Palin Centre for Stammering website and the STAMA website, and I'll put some links to that at the end of the session if you want to look at them for some further information. Okay, so to start off, to clear up some of the terminology, so what do you call it? Do you call it stammering versus stuttering? So actually both terms just mean the same thing. They both mean a stoppage in the forward flow of speech. Stammering tends to be used more in the UK, while elsewhere in the world we tend to say, or people tend to refer to stuttering. So particularly in America, they might call it a stutter. But the terms can be used interchangeably. So whatever feels comfortable for you to use, you can use. What you might hear a speech and language therapist that's an SLT refer to as disfluency. So that's the speech and language therapy term that we use to talk about stammering, disfluency. Okay, so thinking about what stammering can actually look like outwardly. So a child who stammers might repeat whole words. So they might say something like, can I do that? They might repeat single sounds or syllables, something like go back, that kind of thing. They might prolong or stretch sounds out. So they might say something like, sometimes I go out. Or they might block, and that means where no sound comes out at all. So you might hear a little bit of a sound happening in their throat where you can hear them kind of tense up and no sound comes out like that. Okay, so there's other secondary behaviours, or you might call them concomitant behaviours, that you might notice if your child is stammering. So they might do some of these things, they might not do these things, but they might show some muscle tension when they're speaking in their face or in the rest of their body. They might make extra body movements because they're trying to push a word out. So they might do something like blinking or tapping their fingers or moving their head in a particular way because they're sort of trying to force a word out. They might make extra body movements just to try to kind of hide the stammering that's happening. So they might hide their mouth with their hand or turn away from you. They might show reduced eye contact. So they might look down or they might look away when they're speaking to you. They might be kind of fidgety and move around when they're talking, and they might seem to have disrupted breathing. So they might sort of run out of breath when they're talking or seem to, or they might take a big deep breath before they start, because very often kids have been told to stop and take a big deep breath before they start talking. So you might notice them take a big inhale before they say something. All right, so thinking about the facts. So this is just a little bit of an overview, I guess, about stammering and what we know about it. So children generally start stammering when they're between about 2 and 5, and that's when their language skills are typically developing really quickly. Children are starting to use longer words and they're speaking in sentences, and it means that there's a lot more load on the child's kind of still developing speech motor and their language system at that time. And stammering, it can start later than that. It can start gradually or it can start suddenly, but generally what we see is that it begins between about 2 and 5 years of age. Next little fact, stammering affects equal numbers of boys and girls to start with, but it's more likely to persist in boys. So in older children and in adults, there are about 4 or 5 times as many boys who stammer as girls. There is research to show that about 8% of children will stammer at some point, so it's a reasonably common occurrence. And lots of children, the stammering resolves. So within the adult population, about 1% of people stammer. It's important to note that stammering usually varies a lot. So A child might be stammering more on one day than another, or more in one situation than another. And that's due to lots of things, both kind of internal to your child and about the world around them. So there's lots and lots of factors that might affect their fluency. So what you might notice is that bit of variation in how they present. Okay, a few more facts. There is no relationship between stammering and intellectual ability. So you can be incredibly clever and amazingly capable and smart, and you might still stammer. There's no link between those things. People from all walks of life, everywhere in the world, stammer. And there's lots of really very highly successful people who stammer. So I've put a little picture of Emily Blunt there. She's talked quite openly about having a stammer as a child. There's some videos of her online and things like that talking about it, which are quite interesting to watch. So having that difficulty has obviously not held her back. She's one of the most famous actresses in the world, I guess. But yeah, stammering has historically been a source of stigma. And what our role as speech therapists is partly about changing how people perceive people who stammer. And I think, you know, there are positive steps towards stammering being more accepted in society, but it is gradual. But we can all have a part to play in making that happen. Yeah, I guess it's important at this stage just to note that everybody who stammers is different. Everyone's stammer will be unique to them. It'll look a bit different. It will mean different things to them. And I guess one of the enduring myths about stammering is that people who stammer are nervous and they lack confidence, but that's actually not the case. What the research would show is that children of kind of any personality type can stammer. Sometimes there is a bit of a feedback loop with stammering and being nervous. If children have had bad reaction to them stammering, then it might make them lacking confidence a little bit. But the nervousness and lacking confidence isn't why stammering happens. Some kids are really confident and they're not worried about stammering, and other children are a wee bit more worried about stammering. So there isn't a kind of one size fits all approach for stammering because it's really very different for everybody. Okay, so moving on to think about what causes stammering. So stammering is what we describe as multifactorial, meaning there's lots of different factors that play a part in stammering emerging in a child. So number one there, I put a picture of some genes, and that's because stammering does tend to run in families. So it's definitely influenced by, if not completely explained by, genetics. So we know that because there's been some studies done on identical twins, and you can have twins where one twin will stammer and the other doesn't. So that means that genetics are not the only answer to why stammering happens, but there's definitely a link in there between stammering and genetics. Okay, so the second little cause that we'll look at is some differences in brain development. So research that's been done lately suggests that stammering arises because the complex neural pathways involved in speaking in people who stammer are just slightly different to those of other people who don't stammer. So there's just a little bit of a difference in those connections and how efficiently the brain is able to communicate than people who don't stammer. So there's these really, really subtle little differences in people who stammer's brains. Okay, and the next little factor that's part of this multifactorial picture of what causes stammering are language skills. So like we chatted about just earlier, stammering tends to start when young children are developing their language skills really rapidly, so that between age 2 and 5 kind of stage, and they think that there is a link between those two things, because there's this increase in linguistic demands, so on what the child is having to do linguistically, so with their language, with their communication, there's this increased demand on what their system is able to do and how fast they're able to sort of catch up with what those demands are on them. So it's particularly relevant for kids who maybe have delayed language development or other speech and language difficulties, or for children who have really quite advanced language skills. So those things will put extra load on their language system, and it makes them just a little bit more vulnerable to starting to stammer. But yeah, a little side is that being bilingual or multilingual is not a cause of stammering. So just important to note that there when we're talking about language, if that applies to anybody. Okay, and number 4 little cause is something called speech motor skills. So I put a picture there of it's meant to be inside your brain, delivering some signals. So motor planning is the plan that your brain makes to give an instruction to your muscles to do something. So we make these little plans in our brains, and the messages get sent to our muscles, and those messages are super complicated for speaking. We're doing so much with our mouth all the time when we're speaking, moving our tongue, moving our lips, and coordinating all those really fine little movements. And research would say that adults who stammer have slightly less efficient speech motor skills, and they maybe need a little bit more time to make the movements involved in speaking. So what that would suggest is that people who stammer just have a little bit of vulnerability around those speech motor skills, so getting those messages to the muscles to coordinate all those really fine little movements for speaking. And there's research going on looking at that skill in children, so we know that's true of adults. We don't have definitive proof right now that it's the same in children, but the suggestion would be that it could be the case. When children who stammer speak quickly because they're trying to keep up or because they're trying to say something that's long and complicated, what that might do is just put too much load on that capacity that they have to send all those little messages and coordinate all those fine muscle skills, so your speech motor skills. So if they're speaking quickly, that's just putting a bit too much load on that system, and that might lead to them stammering. So kind of the higher the demand on the speech motor system, the more likely a child is to stammer. So if they're being hurried, or if they're really excited and they're trying to tell you something quickly, that sort of thing, that can make them more likely to stammer. Okay, final little slide in the causes section are thoughts, emotions, and temperament. So, like we touched on earlier, stammering doesn't start because a child is anxious or because they're shy or nervous. But if a child has a stammer, then they might stammer more if they're feeling anxious, and that might lead to them becoming less confident about speaking. But as I said, being nervous isn't the root cause of the stammering. It might just have a sort of part to play in it persisting, I suppose. So research into the broader aspects of children's temperament, children who stammer's temperament, suggests that some kids who stammer might experience emotions relatively intensely compared to their peers, and they might find it a little bit harder to regulate their emotions. But that's an area that's kind of under research at the moment as well. Okay, so I wanted to show you this. This is the Palin model, and this is something that we use when we're assessing a child and when we're chatting to you about a child, and it's just to kind of put all those factors that I've just rambled through into something visual to help you understand how it all kind of fits together. Because stammering is a complex picture, it's multifactorial, there's lots of things we need to consider when we're thinking about treating a stammer, or even just, learning to understand this stammer for this particular child. So this model is quite a nice way of thinking about all those things. You can see in the middle, we've got this wee person who's stammering, and we think about their physiological factors, so those things about their body that might have an impact on them stammering, their family history. Are they a boy? They're more likely to stammer to continue to stammer if they're a boy, things like that. We think about their language and communication skills. Have they maybe had a bit of delay in learning language? Has that put a bit of load onto their language system? Or are they really, really advanced in their language? Is that putting a bit of load into their system? Psychological factors are those things about temperament, how they react when they stammer. And the speech motor are those messages we were talking about that your brain makes sense to your muscles, and we know that that's a bit of an area of vulnerability with people who stammer. And then finally, we consider the environment that that child is in. So it's important to say that parents do not cause a child to stammer. Nothing you've done or haven't done has made your child stammer, but this environmental bit is just in there to help us consider what are those factors that might just have an influence on that child stammering a bit more or a bit less. Okay, so I suppose this is the kind of $1 million question, isn't it? Will it go away? And I'm sure if you've had, well, you're here because your child has perhaps started to stammer, I'm sure this has crossed your mind. So unfortunately, it's not possible to say black and white or definitively what's going to happen for any child who stammers. But most young children do stop stammering without needing any help. It'll kind of fade away naturally. And that will tend to happen within a year or so of it starting, if it's going to. So very often, stammering might just resolve before a child starts school. But some children will continue to stammer. So we think about those kind of risk factors that might indicate that they might continue to stammer. So we think about things like, do they have a family history of stammering? Is the child a boy? Or if they've had difficulties with speech sounds, so speaking clearly, they've had difficulties with that, that can sometimes suggest that stammering might persist. But not one of those things mean that your child is definitely going to stammer either. They just increase the vulnerability of the child to stammering continuing. So, it's really tricky to say. We can't say one way or another if it will definitely stay or not. There isn't really a cure for stammering. And when we deliver therapy, it tends to be about helping that child to be confident and comfortable with themselves and communicating really confidently. And that's what our priority as speech therapists is. It's about that confidence and the child being able to communicate the best they can, rather than being a perfectly fluent speaker who never stammers. So that's the approach we take to it. We look at making them confident rather than making them perfectly fluent. First of all, having a little think about sort of general well-beings and the routines within your home. Parents will often say that when their child is tired, that they'll notice them stammering more. So it's really important just to think about the sort of general routines in your house, the child's sleeping and eating patterns. So if you have a sense that your child needs a bit more sleep, then think about if there's any changes you can maybe make to the routine that might just help them get to bed that wee bit earlier. And if you need a bit of support or discussion around implementing those kinds of routines, definitely have a chat to your health visitor, or if your child's a bit older, to your GP, because all of those factors can have a bit of an influence on the child's fluency. So it's important to think about all of those things. In a similar vein, thinking about the pace of life at your house. So is there a way to slow down the pace of life a wee bit? Family life is just busy. That's kind of a fact of having kids and having a family. But are there times when it's really, really rushed in your house? And it might be possible just to do things a wee bit differently, just to give everybody a little bit more breathing space and help everyone to just be a wee bit more relaxed. Yeah, maybe think about one or two little practical things that could maybe just take that kind of pace of life down a wee bit. Obviously, with COVID and everything, everybody's routine is all a bit up in the air at the moment. But just thinking about one little tiny change that you can make that might just make the whole atmosphere a wee bit more relaxed that day. Thinking then about that language model that you're giving to your child. So with the thing in mind about children whose language is a little bit delayed or children whose language is really advanced, putting a bit of pressure on their fluency, it's just thinking about how do we make that language load just a little bit easier for them. And one thing we can do is model language to them that's an appropriate level for where they're at. So maybe if your child has like super advanced language skills, maybe you can just dial back a little bit when you're speaking to them and speak to them in slightly simpler sentences so that they're not getting that sort of pressure on to use lots of big words and lots of long sentences. Similarly, if your child has a little bit of delay with language or has language difficulties, just making sure that the language that you're using to speak to them is nice and simple, nice short sentences, nice clear language, just so that we're taking that load off them a little bit. Yeah, and I guess just to pause at this point, maybe you're feeling a bit like I've kind of overloaded you with all these things you could be doing. Just remember that you are, as a parent, already naturally doing loads and loads of stuff that is going to be super helpful for your child. Okay, so you know your child better than anybody else, and you can instinctively kind of tune into what they need. So if there's things that you're doing that you feel are helping them, just try doing a wee bit more of that and see if that helps. So yeah, there's lots of advice I'm kind of throwing at you, but sometimes it's good to just trust your instincts and notice what's working and do that thing a little bit more. Yeah, just to touch back on special time again, so that's that short little 5 minutes time to play with each parent. So stammering therapy might look something like doing this special time in a kind of structured way, and your therapist might be talking you through doing this 3 to 5 times a week and doing it in a kind of structured way. But yeah, there's no reason that you can't start straight away doing special time. But yeah, I guess it's just important to focus on being really, really present with your child during that wee 5 minutes, giving them your undivided attention, listening to what they're saying rather than how they're saying it, and making sure that they know that time, those 5 minutes, and it doesn't need to be more than that, but 5 minutes in that day is time for you and for them to just be with each other and connect. And you can try practicing one of those strategies that they talked about in the video, like using pauses, talking at a nice relaxed pace, not overdoing questions, all that kind of thing. But the important bit is that time together. Okay, so we've talked a lot about things that you could do, things that you could try. Is there anything that I shouldn't do? Is probably something that's crossed your mind as well. So what we would say about that is, yes, there are a few things that it's a good idea to try and avoid doing. Top one being giving advice. So even though you're trying to help the child, really saying things like slow down, take a deep breath, can kind of break their flow a little bit. And what it's kind of saying to them without using words is that you're kind of more focused on and more interested in how they're saying the words rather than what they're saying. So instead of giving them some advice, telling them to slow down or take a deep breath, just listen to what they're saying rather than how they're saying it, and give them lots and lots of time to finish what they're trying to say. Another wee no is reminding your child to use techniques. So maybe your child has had speech therapy before, maybe they've learned some techniques, or maybe they're just things that they do that seem to help them. Reminding them to use those things when they're talking, again, just puts that focus on how they're saying something rather than what they're saying. It's giving them that sort of underlying message that you're not very comfortable with the way that they're speaking, that there's something wrong with what they're doing. So we just need to be really careful about reminding kids to use, something to make them more fluent. What might be a good idea to do is just ask your child whether they find it helpful to have a little reminder to do that thing that helps them to be a bit more fluent, or would they rather that you just listen to what they're trying to say? And most children will probably say, please just listen. Yeah, another little topic to think about, how should I talk about stammering with my child? I think there's been lots of misinformation about this topic over the years. If your child is really not aware that they're stammering, then you don't really need to say anything about it. However, sometimes even really little children are aware at some level of having difficulty getting their words out. And when that's the case, it's really important to find a way of talking about it together. Finding a way that feels natural and feels right for you. So yeah, what we don't want is that sort of conspiracy of silence around stammering where people are worried to mention it in case it makes it worse. What we want is for families to be able to talk about it comfortably. So you can acknowledge stammering if the child seems to be aware that words are stuck and it's been difficult for them to get words out. If they're showing that they're maybe frustrated or they're a bit upset about that, then it's totally fine to acknowledge that stammering has happened. So you could say something like, oh, that got a bit sticky, but don't worry, there's no rush. So you're saying that in a nice, warm and matter-of-fact way, in the same way that you would if the child was having trouble tying their shoelaces or doing their zip up or something. You'd say, oh, that was a bit tricky. Don't worry, we'll try it again, kind of thing. So in the same way that you would treat them having a bit of difficulty around learning any other skill, it's fine to acknowledge that. And how should you talk about stammering with your child? I guess the really important thing to remember is trying to use neutral language about it. And it's really, really easy to talk about stammering in a bit of a negative way. Like you might be saying, oh, that your stammering was really bad today, wasn't it? And again, it's a really subtle little thing, but you're just giving a little bit of a message that stammering is bad, stammering is negative. And actually, could we find a way just to talk about it in a bit more of a neutral way? What I would tend to do is talk about, if you are talking about stammering, you can talk about noticing it more or noticing it less, rather than your stammer was bad today or your stammer was good today. So it's just, it's a really subtle little change to make, just to help that child frame what's happening to them in a more positive and less scary way, I suppose. So if we receive a referral for a child who's stammering, we will do an assessment with you as the family, and our assessment process is designed to help you to understand the different factors that are relevant for your child. So thinking back about the little picture, the model with the child in the middle, and we thought about all those things that are linked to the child, that surround the child. Our assessment process is designed just to help you to understand all those factors that are relevant for your child. We might give advice at that stage, and we might give advice and then discharge, or we might look at giving some treatment. So treatment might be direct or indirect. Very likely, if your child is sort of under 7, the likely approach is that we would look at helping you to develop some skills to manage your child's stammer. So we'd be unlikely to be working directly with the child, giving them techniques or anything like that. It's more about making sure the family has some really good communication skills going on at home. And direct treatment refers to that work with the child, where we're maybe looking at working on how they're speaking in a wee bit more detail. But largely what we look at are those communication skills around the people who are around the child. Speech and language therapists work in partnership with schools and with parents and carers just to make sure that the environment for the child is as best as it can be. And if it's appropriate, we might look at referring on to another service like CAMHS, mental health service, if we felt that was appropriate.